They don't know I'm making this tape. If they found out, if they had any inkling that I was breaking 30 years of perfect, suffocating silence, I'd already be dead. Or worse, much worse, they'd have me back in that room. The white one. The one with no windows, no clocks, where time is just a theory, and the only thing you can hear is the ceaseless 60-cycle hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. But a hum is a good thing. A hum is a luxury you can't appreciate until it's gone. I know what real silence is. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill your ears, but fills your bones, your soul. The kind of silence that has weight. I'm one of the few people on Earth who has ever truly heard it. My name is Frank Kowalski. At least, that's the name on the driver's license, the social security card, the whole life they built for me after they pulled me out of the wreckage. My real name, the one my mother gave me, is buried in a concrete sarcophagus at the bottom of Lake Superior, along with everything else that mattered. The little red record light on this old Panasonic tape deck is glowing in the gloom of my basement. It's a single, defiant eye in the darkness. It's the only light I allow myself most nights. It reminds me of another red light, a small indicator on a vast console of blinking machinery. The light that told us we were still operational on the night the world beneath our feet just uncoupled. I'm not doing this for fame. God, no. I'm not doing it for revenge or to prove some grand conspiracy. I'm doing this because I am 68 years old, and my doctor, a nice young man who knows nothing, told me last week that my heart is tired. He called it congestive heart failure, a tired pump, and the thought of dying, of my own internal rhythm stopping, terrifies me in a way he could never understand. I'm afraid that when my own heart goes silent, I'll be right back there, in that other, bigger silence. Permanently this time. I have to get this out, because the pattern is starting again. I see it. It's not in the headlines, not yet. It's in the margins. It's in the strange, buried reports about unexplained atmospheric phenomena over the Pacific. It's in the articles about mass bird migrations going haywire, flocks of geese flying south in the middle of summer. They give it names, tidy little explanations for the public. Anomalous magnetic fluctuations, unseasonal jet stream shifts, climate change. They're lying. I know what it is. It's not a fluctuation. It's an echo, a tremor. It's the aftershock of what happened in 1982. And if it's happening again, someone else needs to know the truth before it's buried for good. I have to tell you about United States Navy Listening Post Kingfisher. I have to tell you what happened to Operator First Class Miller and Operator Second Class Thompson. And I have to tell you what happened to me. It all started, as these things so often do, with a phone call in the dead of night. A voice from a past I thought I had successfully buried. It was October. The kind of cold, damp, miserable October you only get in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The autumn leaves were no longer beautiful. They were a brown, rotting sludge on the ground, and the sky had the permanent, depressing color of wet asphalt. I'd been officially retired for 2 years. 2 long years of trying to convince myself that I'd earned the peace, that the nightmares about the submarine, about the USS Thresher, would someday fade. I was a sonar technician, a signals intelligence specialist. My entire life had been dedicated to listening to the subtle whispers of Soviet boomers gliding through the deep, cold canyons of the Atlantic. And on that one single, catastrophic day in April of 1963, I hadn't heard what I was supposed to hear. Or maybe I had heard exactly what it sounds like when a state-of-the-art nuclear submarine implodes under the crushing weight of the sea. That sound, a horrifying metallic shriek followed by an abrupt final silence, had been my constant companion for nearly 20 years. So I was living in a small mortgaged house, catching walleye, drinking a little too much Pabst Blue Ribbon, and trying, desperately, to get used to the mundane quiet of life on dry land. And then the phone rang. At precisely 2:15 in the morning. The voice on the other end was gravelly, tired, and instantly recognizable. It was Admiral Hennessy, a man I hadn't seen or heard from since the day he'd personally signed my early retirement papers, citing chronic auditory-related stress. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He just said, his voice cutting through the static, "Frank, we need your ears. Pack a bag for cold weather. A car will be at your house in 1 hour." It wasn't phrased as an order. It was phrased as a request from an old, powerful man, and that made it infinitely more terrifying. You can disobey an order. You can't refuse a request like that. An hour later, exactly as he'd said, a black, featureless Ford sedan pulled up to my curb, its engine a low, menacing purr. The driver didn't get out. I threw my duffel bag in the back and climbed in. We drove through the sleeping suburbs in complete silence, heading to a small private airstrip I never knew existed. An old, beat-up twin-engine Cessna was waiting on the tarmac, its propellers already turning slowly in the pre-dawn gloom. Inside, a young man was strapped into one of the seats. He had a buzz cut so severe it looked like it had been done with a cheese grater, and a jawline that looked like it could crack walnuts. He introduced himself, his voice flat and professional, as Lieutenant Casey, a Navy SEAL. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were cold and empty. He looked me over, this old, slightly paunchy retiree in a worn-out jacket like I was a piece of inconvenient luggage he'd been tasked with transporting. The flight was long, loud, and miserable. We flew north, over endless dark forests of pine and birch that grew wilder and more desolate with every passing mile. The civilization below us just thinned out and vanished. I finally broke the silence and asked Casey where the hell we were going. He just shrugged, his shoulders barely moving. "My orders are to deliver you to the destination, sir. The designation is Listening Post Kingfisher. That's the extent of my briefing." Kingfisher? I'd never heard of it. I knew the SOSUS arrays in the Atlantic like the back of my hand. I knew the coastal intercept stations in Virginia and Maine. But a listening post on the Great Lakes? In the middle of nowhere? Who were we listening for? The Canadian Coast Guard? The pilot, a grizzled man in his 50s with a sun-beaten face named Gus, must have overheard us. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "You boys headed up to the Zimorodoc?" he asked, his voice a shout over the roar of the engines. He used the Russian word for Kingfisher. That's what the locals call it. Real strange place. Navy built it in the late 50s during the panic. Then it went dark for a decade. Then a few years back they fired it up again. No one knows what they're really doing there. The rumor is, they ain't listening for the Russians. They're listening to the ground itself. I let out a skeptical laugh. Listening to the ground? What kind of backwoods crap is that? Gus just shrugged, his eyes fixed on the horizon. You can believe what you want. The old-timers from the Ojibwe tribe? They say that patch of rock is cursed. They say there's a spirit that lives in the cliffs there. One that drives men mad. Not with noise, though. With silence. They say it can steal the sound right out of the world, and once it does, a man is left all alone with the noise in his own soul. And that, mister, is the most terrifying thing a man can ever hear. Casey snorted with derision, a clear dismissal of such superstitious nonsense. I tried to dismiss it too, chalking it up to the kind of local folklore you find in any isolated community. But there was something in the way Gus said it, in his completely matter-of-fact tone, that planted a tiny, cold seed of unease in my gut. We finally landed on a tiny, almost invisible airstrip hacked out of the dense forest. An old, olive-drab military deuce-and-a-half truck was waiting, its engine idling. The driver, another silent young man in an army green uniform with no identifying insignia, just gave a curt nod and motioned for us to get in the back. He drove us down a bumpy, washed-out logging road that was more mud than gravel. The forest became a thick, oppressive canopy overhead, creating a dark, damp tunnel of green and brown. And that's when it happened. The first undeniable sign that something was fundamentally wrong. I had my trusty old Seiko automatic on my wrist, a gift from my wife on our 20th anniversary. A watch that had never failed me. I glanced down at it. The second hand was perfectly still. The time was frozen at exactly 3:37. "Damn thing," I muttered, tapping the crystal. "Must have finally given up the ghost." Casey, sitting across from me, looked down at his own watch, a brand new military-issue shock-proof Casio G-Shock. "That's weird," he said, and for the first time I heard a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. Mine stopped too. He smacked it against his palm. Nothing. The digital display was frozen. He leaned forward to the cab. "Hey, you got the time?" The driver didn't say a word. He just silently held up his left wrist. It was bare. He wasn't wearing a watch. He just kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel. We drove for another 20 minutes in a heavy, unnerving silence, broken only by the grinding gears of the truck. And then, the forest abruptly fell away. And we saw it. Listening Post Kingfisher, it was, without a doubt, the most ugly, soul-crushing piece of architecture I had ever laid eyes on. A single, brutalist block of windowless gray concrete, clinging to a desolate, rocky point on the shore of Lake Superior. The sky above was a solid sheet of leaden gray, and the water of the Great Lake was unnaturally, impossibly still, like a vast sheet of polished black glass. There wasn't a single ripple. The chain-link gates of the station were swung wide open, and one of the heavy metal gates was rocking gently back and forth in a breeze I couldn't feel, emitting a long, lonely, rhythmic squeak. There were no lights in the few windows that faced us, no guards patrolling the perimeter, no signs of human life whatsoever. The entire facility felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us, and I had the sudden, chilling feeling that it had been waiting for a very, very long time. We climbed out of the back of the truck, the silence hitting us like a physical blow. The driver didn't turn off the engine. He just sat there, staring straight ahead through the windshield, his part of the mission apparently complete, now that he had delivered us to the mouth of this concrete beast. Casey, ever the professional, immediately fell back on his training. He unclipped his radio from his belt. "This is Lieutenant Casey, call sign Sierra 4, calling Listening Post Kingfisher. Do you copy? Over." The only response was a faint, empty hiss of static. He tried again, increasing the gain. "Kingfisher, this is Sierra 4. Respond. Over." Nothing. It was like shouting into a pillow. The air was cold, so cold it hurt to breathe, and it carried the damp, earthy smell of wet rocks and rotting lakeweed. But underneath that, there was another smell. Something I couldn't place. A faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang, like the taste of a 9-volt battery on your tongue, or the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. And the quiet. My God, the quiet. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It was a presence. A heavy, suffocating blanket of nothing. I'd spent more than half my life at sea, a world of constant sound. The shriek of gulls, the crash of waves, the howl of the wind, the ceaseless thrum of engines. Here, there was none of that. No birds, no squirrels chattering in the trees, not even the hum of insects. Even the wind that was pushing the gate back and forth seemed to be a ghost, a phantom force without a voice. Casey unholstered his Beretta M9, the click of the safety disengaging sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. "Standard procedure, sir. We're going in. You stay behind me." I just nodded, feeling old, soft, and utterly useless. We walked through the open gates, our boots crunching on the gravel drive. The compound was small, maybe an acre, enclosed by a 10-foot chain-link fence topped with 3 strands of rusty barbed wire. Besides the main brutalist blockhouse, there were a few smaller, prefabricated outbuildings. A garage, a storage shed, and a squat concrete structure that housed the diesel generator. Everything looked neglected, but not dilapidated. It looked like a place that had been abandoned in a great hurry. We reached the main building. The door was a slab of heavy steel with a wheel-like handle, the kind you'd find on a naval vessel's watertight compartment. It was designed to keep the ocean out, but it was slightly ajar. Casey put his shoulder to it and pushed. It swung open with a deep, groaning protest. Inside was darkness and a profound, cellar-like cold. Casey switched on a powerful tactical flashlight, and its beam sliced through the gloom, revealing a long, featureless concrete corridor. Thick bundles of black and gray cables snaked along the walls and ceiling, held in place by metal brackets. Papers, curled and damp, were scattered across the floor. We moved forward, our footsteps echoing with an unnatural clarity. The first place we cleared was the living quarters. 2 simple bunks with thin mattresses, both neatly made with military precision. 2 drab olive green lockers stood against the far wall. One had a Dymo label maker sticker that read Miller RJ OP1. The other read Thompson DL OP2. These were the men we were here to find, the operators we were supposed to relieve. On a small metal table between the 2 bunks sat 2 white ceramic mugs, each half full of what looked like black coffee. I reached out and carefully touched the side of one. It was colder than the air in the room, stone cold. But something was profoundly wrong. On the table, on the floor, on the neatly tucked blankets of the bunks, there was a fine, even layer of gray dust. The kind of dust that takes more than a few days to accumulate. Maybe a week, maybe 2. The coffee in those mugs should have been a petri dish of green and black mold by now. But it wasn't. It was just cold, black, and perfectly clear, as if it had been poured and abandoned just 10 minutes ago. And then we saw the cables. That was the most bizarre, the most inexplicable thing of all. Thick, braided steel cables, the kind used for heavy-duty winches or moorings, emerged from the walls, the ceiling, even from holes drilled directly through the concrete floor. They were everywhere. They were wrapped around the legs of the bunks. They crisscrossed the room at odd angles, forming a chaotic web of galvanized steel. Some were attached to the walls with massive, industrial-grade anchor bolts, the kind you use to secure girders in a skyscraper. Others had been fed outside through crudely drilled holes in the concrete walls. We followed one of the cables to a back door and stepped outside. The scene that greeted us was one of pure, methodical madness. Dozens of these steel cables stretched from all over the building, snaking across the rocky ground to the surrounding granite formations. Their ends were anchored deep into the bedrock with expansion bolts that had been driven in with powerful rock drills. The entire building was literally moored to the shoreline, lashed to the planet like a giant, terrified concrete beast trying to keep from floating away. "What in the ever-loving hell?" Casey muttered, his flashlight beam tracing the path of one thick cable to a huge, freshly drilled hole in a granite boulder. "This looks like the paranoid delusions of a madman. What were they thinking?" That a stiff breeze was going to blow this place into the lake? I didn't say anything. I just stared at the impossible network of cables, and a deep, irrational dread began to bloom in my chest. This didn't look like the work of insanity. It looked like the work of profound desperation. It looked like something done by men who were still thinking logically, methodically, and with great precision, but whose fundamental premise, whose entire perception of reality, had become unhinged. We went back inside and made our way to the heart of the station, the operations room. It was a large, windowless chamber dominated by floor-to-ceiling racks of electronic equipment, oscilloscopes, spectrum analyzers, massive reel-to-reel tape machines, all of it heavy, analog, late 70s tech. Most of the instruments were powered down, their screens dark. But on the main console, on the primary screen of the station's central hydroacoustic analysis system, something was glowing. It was a single, unwavering, perfectly flat line of phosphorescent green. It stretched from one side of the circular screen to the other. Absolutely horizontal. Absolutely straight. There were no spikes, no fuzz, no background noise, no interference. I had spent 25 years of my life staring at screens just like this one. I knew, with an unshakable certainty born of 100,000 hours of observation, that such a line was a physical impossibility. There is always background noise. There is always the static of the atmosphere, the faint crackle of solar wind hitting the magnetosphere, the deep, planetary thrum of the Earth itself. That constant, low-frequency electromagnetic hum, the one the scientists call the Schumann resonance, the planet's heartbeat. It's always there. It's the baseline. It's the definition of zero against which all other signals are measured. But here, on this screen, it was gone. This wasn't zero. This was less than zero. This was an absolute mathematical dead void. And then, on the main operator's console, tucked under a messy pile of diagnostic printouts, I found it. The station logbook. A standard issue, government green, hardcover logbook. I picked it up. The cover felt cold and slick. I opened it. Most of the pages were filled with neat, precise, almost calligraphic handwriting. I flipped to the end. The last formal entry had been made by Operator First Class Miller. The date was 12 days prior. The time was 0200 hours. But after that entry, there were 2 more sentences. They were scrawled across the page in a shaky, ragged, barely legible hand that was a shocking contrast to the neatness of the preceding pages. I read them aloud, and in the dead, sterile silence of that room, my own voice sounded like a desecration, a violation of some sacred quiet. The hum is gone. My God, it's just gone. That first night at Listening Post, Kingfisher was a slow, grinding assault on the nerves. We made the decision to hole up in the operations room. The idea of sleeping in the bunk room, in the beds where Miller and Thompson had last slept before whatever it was they did, was unthinkable. It felt like sleeping in a tomb. We managed to get the diesel generator running. The sound of it kick into life was a revelation, a blessing. Its steady, monotonous, throbbing hum was a shield against the oppressive silence outside. It filled the void, bringing with it a fragile illusion of normalcy, a reminder that the world of machines and predictable physics still existed. Casey, the consummate soldier, unrolled his sleeping bag on the cold concrete floor, placed his M9 pistol within easy reach, and with a discipline I could only envy, was dead asleep within 10 minutes. I couldn't. Sleep was a country I couldn't find on any map. I just sat there, in the worn leather of the operator's chair, and stared at that horrifying, serene, dead flat green line on the oscilloscope. The hum is gone. The words were a relentless drumbeat in my skull. What could it possibly mean? A catastrophic, multi-system technical failure. But for every single one of the deeply buried hydrophone sensors, the preamps, the entire complex analysis system, to fail at the exact same time and in the exact same way, all defaulting to a perfect mathematical zero? The statistical probability of that was so infinitesimally small as to be zero itself. I tried to force my mind down rational paths. Maybe it was a unique, localized geological anomaly, some bizarre pocket of rock that was shielding us from all electromagnetic radiation. Or perhaps a powerful, inaudible infrasound signal broadcast from some secret military experiment was overwhelming the sensors and creating a dead zone. I got up and began to pace the room, the generator's hum a comforting anchor. And that was when I felt it for the first time. A subtle, almost imperceptible wave of vertigo. It wasn't the spinning kind of dizziness you get from standing up too fast. This was different. It was a strange, disquieting sensation of unsteadiness, as if the solid concrete floor beneath my feet was no longer entirely reliable, as if I were standing on the deck of a massive ship, moving through a perfectly calm sea. The movement was so slight, so gentle, that you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening. I stopped pacing, planting my feet wide, concentrating on the feeling. After a moment, it passed. I wrote it off as a combination of stress, exhaustion, and the power of suggestion from reading that damn logbook. You're an old fool, Frank, I told myself, letting ghost stories get to you. I returned to the chair and tried to will myself to sleep. Through the drone of the generator, I thought I could hear a faint whistling sound, like wind in a ventilation shaft. But it was a strange, intermittent sound, almost melodic. Then I heard a distinct creak, the same lonely, rhythmic creak of the front gate we'd heard when we arrived. But I knew the wind had died down hours ago. I opened my eyes. Casey was a motionless lump in his sleeping bag. I crept to the one small, reinforced window in the room and peered out. The surface of Lake Superior was a sheet of obsidian. The gate was perfectly still. I went back to my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. It had to be paranoia. A textbook case, isolation, strange circumstances, a suggestible mind. The brain fills in the blanks with its own fears. I forced myself to focus on what I knew, on the tech. I turned on one of the big reel-to-reel teak tape machines. The tape on the supply reel was blank. I threaded it, hit the record button, plugged in a heavy Shure microphone, and began to speak, my voice a low murmur. Test, test. October 1st, 1982. This is Frank Kowalski at Listening Post Kingfisher, attempting to document and diagnose a total system failure. I spoke for about 5 minutes, detailing everything we had found, my voice a steady professional drone. Then I rewound the tape and hit play. My voice came back from the speakers, clear and sharp. But behind it, buried deep in the signal, there was something else. A faint but distinct crackling noise. A dry, papery static like the sound of someone slowly crumpling a cellophane bag right next to the microphone. I listened to the recording again, turning the volume up. The crackling was definitely there. It hadn't been in the room when I was recording. It had been imprinted directly onto the magnetic tape. And as I listened, I felt it again. The vertigo. But it was stronger this time. The whole room seemed to gently, but undeniably, tilt about 5 degrees to the left. I grabbed the edge of the console to steady myself. The sensation was so real, so visceral, that I looked over at the glass of water I'd set on the desk. The surface of the water was perfectly level. It wasn't the room. It was me. My vestibular system was malfunctioning. But why? Could it be that metallic taste in the air? Some kind of neurotoxin? I walked the perimeter of the room again, sniffing the air like a bloodhound. Nothing. Just the cold smell of concrete and the faint scent of ozone from the powered-up electronics. I decided I needed fresh air. Real air. I eased out of the operations room, careful not to wake Casey. The long corridor was dark and cavernous. I reached the heavy steel front door and pushed it open. The night was cold, moonless, and starless. I stepped out onto the concrete pad in front of the station and took a deep, lung-searing breath of the frigid air. And that's when I saw it. It wasn't a creature. It wasn't a monster or a silhouette. It was a distortion in the very fabric of the world. Directly in front of me, about 30 feet away, the air itself seemed to shimmer for a split second, like the heat haze rising from a summer highway. A warped, transparent patch of reality about the size of a tall man hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then it simply vanished, snapping back into focus. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, unable to process what my eyes had just seen. It couldn't have lasted more than a second. An optical illusion? A trick of tired eyes? I scrubbed at my face with my hands. Nothing. Everything was as it should be. But I knew what I had seen. I stood out there in the crushing silence for another 10 minutes, my eyes scanning the darkness. But the phenomenon did not repeat. I finally retreated back inside, bolting the heavy door behind me. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. I was done trying to find rational explanations. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very core, that something was happening at this station that did not play by the rules of the world I knew. In the morning, when the first weak, gray light of dawn broke over the lake, I went back outside to that same spot. The night had been damp, and a delicate, crystalline layer of frost coated the concrete pad. It was everywhere, except for one place. Right where I had seen the shimmering distortion, there was a perfectly round, perfectly dry patch of concrete, about 6 feet in diameter, as if someone had taken a giant, invisible branding iron and pressed it against the ground. I called for Casey. He came out, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, squinting against the pale light. I pointed a trembling finger at the patch. "I saw something here last night," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at the dry spot, then at my face. I could see the cold, professional calculus in his eyes. He was assessing the situation, and the situation was me. "Probably a hot air vent from the generator exhaust under the slab," he said, his voice dismissive. "Or an oil drip. Don't worry about it, sir. You're just exhausted." He turned his back on me and walked back into the building. I was left alone, staring at that impossible dry circle, and for the first time since the thresher went down, I felt the icy grip of true, profound loneliness. I realized then that Casey would never believe me until he saw something with his own eyes. And I began to pray to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that he never, ever would. After that night, after seeing the impossible dry circle on the concrete, I knew with a terrifying certainty that we couldn't just sit here and wait for a rescue that might never come. Whatever had happened to Miller and Thompson, whatever had caused them to engage in their desperate, insane mooring project, it wasn't over. It was still here. It was active. And now, it was aware of us. My raw fear began to curdle and harden into something else. The cold, methodical anger of a lifelong technician facing a machine that refused to behave as it should. If I couldn't trust my own senses, if the very ground beneath my feet felt like a lie, then I had to fall back on the only thing that remained: hard data. And the only source of data we had was that green, government-issue logbook. I found Casey in the small galley, methodically field stripping and cleaning his M9 pistol, an act of ritual normalcy in a world that had lost all meaning. I told him we were done waiting. We were going to conduct a full inch-by-inch search of the entire facility, and we were going to dissect that logbook, line by line, until it gave up its secrets. He agreed, though with a visible reluctance. I could see in his eyes that he was still clinging to the idea that this was a combination of a technical problem and two operators who had simply snapped, run off, or fallen into the lake. He was a man of action, and this place, this problem, offered no one to fight, nothing to shoot. The search was a slow, grim process. We moved from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the dusty gloom. I found myself drawn back to those insane steel cables again and again. I tried to find a pattern, a logic to their placement. They weren't just haphazardly strung up. Most of them were anchored to the main structural pillars and crossbeams of the building. It was as if Miller and Thompson had gotten a copy of the station's architectural blueprints and systematically tried to reinforce its very skeleton. But why? The question gnawed at me, a constant irritating hum in the back of my mind. During the search, we kept finding small, unsettling clues, little breadcrumbs of wrongness. In the small mess hall on one of the tables, a copy of National Geographic from a few months prior lay open. The article was about plate tectonics and continental drift. In the margin, next to a diagram of the Earth's crust, a single word had been scrawled in a frantic pencil: unreliable. In the station's small workshop, we found the tools they had used: several heavy-duty Hilti rock drills. The tungsten carbide bit on one of them had been worn down almost to the nub, glowing with the telltale blue of overheated metal, as if they had been trying to drill through something far harder than granite. Lying on the workbench next to the drill was a chunk of rock, clearly a core sample from their efforts. I picked it up. It was granite, the same pinkish gray granite that made up the entire shoreline. But it felt impossibly, unnervingly light, almost weightless in my hand. It had the mass of a piece of balsa wood. I handed it to Casey without a word. He took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He bounced it in his palm. His expression for the first time shifted from professional skepticism to genuine bewilderment. "That's..." he started, then stopped. "That's not right." It was the first crack in his armor of certainty, the first admission that the laws of physics here had been put on administrative leave. The tension between us thickened. I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye, constantly assessing me, looking for signs that I was the one who was breaking, that my age and my history were making me see ghosts. And in turn, I watched his military confidence, his belief in a world of clear objectives and identifiable threats, slowly being eroded by 1,000 tiny, inexplicable facts. He started checking the magazine of his pistol more frequently. His movements became sharper, more bird-like. We were like two men trapped in a lifeboat beginning to suspect that the other was drinking the seawater. That evening, as the gray, featureless dusk settled outside, we sat at the console in the operations room and opened the logbook. I made the decision to read it aloud. I wanted Casey to hear the words, to feel the progression of the breakdown himself. The first week of entries was a testament to military monotony. September 22nd, 0800, arrived at station, all equipment green. Schumann resonance holding steady at 7.83 Hertz. September 23rd, 1400, commenced full calibration of primary hydrophone array. All systems nominal. On and on it went, a litany of routine checks and balances, the boring, essential work of watching and waiting. And then, on September 29th, the tone began to shift, subtly at first. The entry was logged by Thompson, the junior operator. 0315, logged anomalous power drop in the primary resonance peak. Transient dip of 0.2%. Duration 3 seconds. Self-restored. Miller speculates solar flare activity. I'm not so sure. Data profile doesn't match. Never seen anything like it. The next entry, 6 hours later, was from Miller. 1600. Another dip. Deeper this time. 0.5%. Duration 10 seconds. Ran full system diagnostics. No malfunctions reported. Feeling a bit nauseous. Must have been the canned chili at lunch. I paused and looked up at Casey. His face was a mask of concentration, his jaw tight. Nausea, I said, letting the word hang in the air. Dizziness. He didn't respond, just stared at the logbook. I continued reading. With each passing day, the entries grew more anxious. The drops in the Earth's resonance became deeper, longer. They described their frantic attempts to isolate the problem, their growing arguments. Miller, the senior man, the one in charge, clung stubbornly to the idea of a technical malfunction. Thompson, younger, perhaps more open-minded, began to suspect the problem was external. September 30th, 2100. Thompson is spouting some wild theories about geology. Says he can feel a vibration in the bedrock. I don't feel a thing, but this damn headache won't quit. And there's this weird sensation, like I'm on a ship. A constant, gentle seasickness, even though the lake is dead calm. And then came the entry that made the fine hairs on my arm stand up. October 1st, Thompson's handwriting. Oh, 200. It was gone. The whole thing. It just vanished. For 5 full minutes. Every screen, every sensor showed absolute perfect zero. It was like someone just switched the planet off. And in those 5 minutes, dear God, in those 5 minutes, I felt us drifting. Not on the water. We were adrift in nothing. The entire room, the whole building, it tilted. I swear to God, it tilted. I almost fell over. Miller felt it too. He won't admit it, but I saw the look on his face. The pure, animal terror. This isn't the equipment. It's us. It's reality itself. I stopped reading. The hum of the generator outside suddenly seemed frail, a tiny sound pushing back against an infinite void. I looked at the unwavering green line on our own oscilloscope. Absolute zero. It hadn't come back. For Miller and Thompson, the world had come back online after 5 minutes. For us, it was still offline. We flipped through the last few pages. The entries became a frantic scroll, the handwriting of men coming apart. They described a spiraling sense of vertigo, a complete loss of their sense of balance. They wrote that heavy objects felt lighter, that they sometimes had to grab onto consoles to keep from floating up from the floor, and that was when they began their desperate, monumental task with the steel cables. October 2nd, we have to anchor ourselves. We have to bolt the station to the bedrock. It's the only logical course of action. If we become untethered, we'll never get back. The very last entry was dated October 3rd. The handwriting was almost a child's scrawl, the letters misshapen and wild. It was from Miller, the pragmatist, the one who had resisted the madness the longest. His final log entry was the shortest of all. It was a single terrifying sentence that explained everything, and nothing at all. It explained the cables, the broken drill bits, the desperation, the silence. I read it in a whisper, and the words fell into the space between me and Casey like stones into a deep, dark well. Can't feel the floor anymore. We're going to try and get back on. After I read Miller's final terrifying sentence aloud, a new kind of silence descended on the operations room. It was a silence heavier and more profound than the one outside, a silence born of shared, dawning horror. The words, "Can't feel the floor anymore," were no longer just an entry in a logbook. They had become a diagnosis for this place, for this station, for the state of mind of anyone who stayed here too long. Casey finally broke the quiet, his voice a hoarse, ragged whisper. This is a psychological break, a shared delusion. Folie à deux. It has to be. Environmental factors. Maybe some kind of low-frequency sound we can't hear, but it's affecting our inner ears. Or poisoning from some kind of fungus in the ventilation system. It can't be literal. But there was zero conviction in his voice. He was a soldier reciting a manual of rational explanations, desperately trying to build a fortress of logic against a creeping, shapeless tide of the impossible. I didn't bother to argue with him. His fortress was already crumbling. Instead, my eyes still on the logbook, I turned the page. The journal didn't end with Miller's frantic scrawl. There were dozens of blank, ruled pages, and then, near the very back, I found more. Not log entries. These were pages filled with dense, complex calculations, formulas, graphs, hastily drawn diagrams. It was clear that Thompson, even as his sanity was being shredded, had been desperately trying to understand what was happening, to quantify the nightmare. He was a scientist to the bitter end. He had been taking measurements of everything. Barometric pressure, ambient air density, static electrical charge in the room, even the subtle shifts in the building's magnetic field. Most of his notes were far beyond my pay grade, a dizzying mess of physics and differential equations. But some of it, the notes scrawled in the margins, I could understand. He had formulated a theory so insane, so far outside the bounds of known science, that it made perfect, terrifying sense of everything we were experiencing. He proposed that the Schumann resonance was not merely a byproduct of atmospheric lightning strikes, as mainstream science believed. He hypothesized that it was something far more fundamental, a kind of planetary carrier wave, a constant, subtle frequency that continuously tells every atom on Earth how to behave within a gravitational field. It wasn't just a sound, he argued. It was the signal that synchronized all matter with the planet's core reality. It's like a cosmic anchor chain, he had written in a shaky but clear script next to a complex formula involving quantum mechanics. And something has severed the chain. Who was the something? The logbook offered no names, no culprits, but his notes got stranger. Thompson, in his frantic final days, seemed to have discovered that the anomaly, the zone of silence, was not a global event. It was localized. Using portable sensors, he had managed to map the intensity of the null field, as he called it. The result was a crude, hand-drawn map showing a near-perfect sphere of influence, roughly a mile in diameter, and the absolute epicenter of that sphere was not the station itself, but a point deep in the bedrock directly beneath us. "It's not turning off the Earth's hum," read one of his most chilling notes. "It's actively broadcasting a counter-frequency, a perfect cancellation wave. It's creating a bubble of null reality, and we are trapped inside the bubble." As I read those words, I felt that cold, sickening lurch in my own gut again. I remembered my own persistent vertigo, the feeling of the floor being an untrustworthy surface. I remembered the impossibly light piece of granite we'd found in the workshop. It all clicked into place, forming a single, cohesive, horrifying picture. Miller and Thompson hadn't gone mad from isolation. They were the first human beings to experience a phenomenon for which we have no words, a form of sensory deprivation so profound it dissolves the very foundations of perception. They weren't madmen. They were explorers who had fallen off the edge of the map. I kept flipping through the brittle pages. On one of the last pages was a rough but detailed schematic. It was a drawing of the main hydrophone cable, the thick, armored trunk line that ran from the operations room down into the station's sublevel, and from there, was bored directly into the granite bedrock and out into the deep, cold water of the lake. Next to the point on the diagram where the cable entered the rock, Thompson had drawn a large, emphatic black star. Beside it, he had written a single terrifying phrase: "The source is here." It's not just a phenomenon. It's listening. It's reacting to our instruments. It was a revelation that hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just passively sitting inside an anomalous zone. The very tools we were meant to use to listen to the outside world were, in fact, connecting us directly to the source of the anomaly. This station, built to eavesdrop on an ocean, was now plugged directly into the heart of something else, and that something else was eavesdropping on us. Suddenly, Casey shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete. "That's enough!" he almost shouted, his voice cracking with strain. "I've had enough of this! This is a goddamn horror story, not an operational log. It's the ramblings of two men who went crazy. We need to focus on what's real. We need to contact base. We need to try and fix the radio." He lunged towards the communications console, a massive bank of Collins and Rockwell transmitters, and began frantically flipping switches and turning dials, his movements jerky and desperate. "It's useless, Casey," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Don't you see? If Thompson was right, if we're inside a null reality bubble, then no radio waves are getting in or out. It's a perfect cage." "Shut up," he yelled, his back still to me. "Just shut your goddamn mouth, Frank." I could see the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his hands trembled as they moved over the controls. He was a cornered animal. All his training, his physical prowess, his mental conditioning. It was all useless against an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't even comprehend. An enemy that was, in its essence, a perfect and total absence. I watched his futile efforts in silence. My own gaze had fallen to the very last page of Thompson's notes. There were no more formulas here. There was only a drawing. A very strange, intricate drawing. It was a complex spiral composed of hundreds of tiny, interlocking, jagged symbols, like some form of alien calligraphy, or a circuit diagram designed by a madman. And beneath this bizarre spiral was one final sentence. It was written in a surprisingly steady, resolute hand, as if in his final moments, a sliver of the scientist's calm had returned to Thompson, and he had reached his ultimate terrible conclusion. We thought it was a malfunction. Then we thought it was a weapon. We were wrong on both counts. It's not broken, and it's not hostile. It's a message. And our presence here, reading this log, listening to this silence, is our reply. We have just told it that we are here. I slowly closed the logbook, the worn green cover feeling cold as a gravestone. Now I understood. I understood everything with a clarity that was worse than any confusion. Our arrival, our search, our fumbling attempts to understand. Even this very moment, us sitting here, deciphering their final words. It was all part of a conversation we hadn't even known we were having. Miller and Thompson had been the first, unwitting sentence. Casey and I were the second. And I was suddenly mortally terrified to find out what the response would be. The hours that followed became a slow-motion descent into a new kind of hell. It was a psychological war, but a war in which only one side knew the rules of engagement. The knowledge from the logbook had changed everything. The oppressive quiet was no longer a neutral state. It was a weapon. The persistent vertigo was no longer a symptom. It was a targeted attack. The very air in the station felt predatory. Casey had fully retreated into a shell of military discipline, the only thing he had left. He stopped trying to fix the radio and instead began a meticulous, almost ritualistic cleaning of his rifle, his pistol, and every piece of gear he had, laying them out on a ground sheet as if preparing for an inspection. He didn't speak a word. His silence was a wall he was building around himself, a fortification against the creeping madness of the place. He was trying to hold on to his world of tangible objects and clear procedures, while the very foundation of that world was turning to sand. But the entity, the anomaly, whatever it was, it seemed to understand that a direct assault on Casey's rigid mind was futile. So it turned its full, malevolent attention to me. It found the crack in my own psychological armor. It found my oldest, deepest wound. It found the thresher. I began to hear sounds. At first they were faint, on the very edge of perception. A low, deep, rhythmic hum. A sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. The sound of the main coolant pumps of a skipjack-class nuclear submarine. I tried to dismiss it as an auditory hallucination, a phantom limb of sound from a past trauma. But the hum grew steadily louder, more insistent. And then, the sonar pings began. The chilling, metallic, high-frequency pings of an active search sonar, echoing in the space behind my eyes. Ping. A long, silent pause. Ping. The exact same interval, the exact same frequency as the ones from the USS Skylark on that final, fatal day. They were inside my head, a rhythmic, inescapable countdown to a disaster that had already happened. I pressed the heels of my hands into my ears, but it did nothing. The sounds weren't coming from the outside. "Do you hear that?" I asked Casey, my voice a strained, trembling thing. He slowly, deliberately, looked up from the rifle bolt he was polishing. His eyes were cold and distant, filled not with concern, but with suspicion. "I don't hear anything, Frank," he said, his voice slow and unnaturally calm. "It's completely silent in here. Maybe you should try to get some rest." He thought I was finally cracking. The old man, the one with the history of auditory stress, was losing his grip. And maybe he was right. But the sounds were becoming more real, more detailed. The pings were now accompanied by other noises, the groaning, protesting shriek of a metal hull under immense pressure, the sound of bulkheads warping, of rivets popping like gunshots. It was the symphony of destruction that had haunted my nightmares for 2 decades. I could see it all behind my closed eyes. The dark, crushing, freezing waters of the Atlantic. The 129 men trapped inside that steel coffin. And me, the sonar tech on the rescue ship. The one who was supposed to find them, who had failed them. It knew. This silent thing, this entity in the rock. It was sifting through my memories like a librarian of despair. It was pulling out my deepest guilt and projecting it directly into my cerebral cortex as a full sensory experience. It was a form of torture so precise, so personal. It was almost elegant. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted me to unravel, thread by thread. I stumbled to the small, reinforced window, desperate for a different view, something to break the feedback loop in my head. The lake was still a sheet of black glass. But then I saw it. On the perfectly still surface of the water, a series of concentric ripples was spreading out from a single point, as if someone had just tossed an invisible pebble into the lake. Then another set of ripples appeared a few yards away, and another. And I suddenly understood. They weren't from pebbles. They were the physical manifestation of the sonar pings. They were not just in my head anymore. They were bleeding out into the real world. I spun around to face Casey. "Look!" I croaked, pointing a shaking finger at the window. "Look at the water! You have to see this!" He let out an exasperated sigh, but he got up and walked slowly to the window. He stared out at the lake for a long, silent moment. I watched his face. I saw his eyes widen. I saw the muscles in his jaw clench. He saw it too. His wall of denial, his fortress of rationality, was finally breached. What is that?" he whispered, his voice small and lost. But before I could even attempt an answer, a new horror began. A sharp click emanated from the main speaker on the operations console, a speaker that was connected to the hydrophone array but had been completely silent. And then, a voice filled the room. A voice distorted by static, broken and fragmented, but a voice that was, without a doubt, my own. Pressure is exceeding crush depth, hull integrity failing. God, the noise. It was a recording of my own panicked voice, screaming into a headset 20 years ago. Words I had tried my entire life to forget, now broadcast back at me from the heart of the anomaly. Casey scrambled away from the console as if it were radioactive. "Turn it off!" he screamed, his voice raw with a terror that was now his own. I lunged for the teak recorder, but the machine was off. The sound wasn't coming from a tape. It was being channeled directly from the source, from the thing in the rock, through its connection to our equipment. It was talking to me, with the voice of my own failure. And that was the final straw for Casey. Pushed beyond the limits of his training, beyond the limits of his sanity, his mind finally snapped and found a simple, brutal, soldier's solution. He decided the enemy wasn't an abstract concept. It was a physical thing, and it was outside. He had to go out and confront it. "I'm going out there," he said, his voice suddenly calm and devoid of all emotion. He walked over and picked up one of the heavy steel cables from the floor. "Casey, no! Don't be a fool!" I yelled, my own fear momentarily forgotten. "You don't understand. There's nothing to fight out there. It's all in here, in our heads, in this bubble." But he wasn't listening. He was wrapping the end of the cable around his waist, securing it with a series of complex knots. "It's a safety line," he said, a grotesque, humorless smirk twisting his lips. "Just in case the floor really is slippery." He strode to the heavy steel door, unlatched it, and stepped out into the gray, featureless, soundless world. I ran after him. He was marching across the concrete pad, unspooling the cable behind him like a lifeline. He reached the cliff's edge, the drop-off to the dark, still water, and he stood there for a moment, a stark silhouette against the gray sky. And then he just stepped off. I braced for a scream, for the splash of his body hitting the water. But there was nothing, just the abrupt tensioning of the steel cable. He was hanging in the air, a few feet from the cliff face. But he wasn't just hanging. His body was convulsing violently. His eyes were bulging from their sockets, wide with a horror I couldn't imagine. He wasn't looking down at the water. He was looking up, at the empty gray sky, and his mouth was stretched open in a silent, unending scream. His arms and legs were flailing, not like a man falling, but like a man drowning, trying to swim his way back to a surface that wasn't there. I realized what had happened. Outside the relative stability of the building, the effect was total. He had lost all spatial awareness. No up, no down. To his brain, he was in a state of perpetual freefall in an infinite void, and the sensory overload had caused a catastrophic neurological shutdown. I grabbed the steel cable, the cold metal biting into my hands, and I started to pull. He was a dead weight, but I dug my heels in and pulled, my muscles screaming in protest. I dragged his limp body back onto the concrete pad. He lay there, curled into a fetal position, his body racked with uncontrollable tremors. He was weeping. There were no sounds, but I could see the convulsive shaking of his shoulders, the tears tracking through the dirt on his face. The strong, capable, unbreakable Navy SEAL had been shattered into a million pieces, and I knew, with a fresh wave of crushing guilt, that it was my fault. I hadn't been able to reach him. I hadn't been able to protect him. I had failed. Again. And as I stood there over his broken form, I felt the concrete floor beneath my own feet give a distinct, powerful lurch, like the deck of a ship hit by a rogue wave. And from somewhere deep inside my mind, or deep inside the rock beneath me, I heard a new sound. Not the shriek of tearing metal, but a soft, dry, impossibly ancient and mocking laugh. After Casey's complete mental and physical collapse, the atmosphere inside Listening Post Kingfisher shifted from one of high-strung tension to one of tomb-like despair. He was no longer a partner, no longer even a presence. He was just a body in the corner, a testament to the station's power. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just lay in his sleeping bag, facing the wall, occasionally racked by a violent, silent tremor. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. He was adrift, lost in that soundless, directionless void I'd pulled his body from, but not his mind. I was well and truly alone. Alone with the silence, alone with this place, alone with my own rapidly fraying sanity. And the entity knew it. It sensed my isolation, my vulnerability. The psychological warfare, the personalized attacks on my past, ceased. The pings and the voices from the thresher vanished. A new phase of the assault began. A phase of direct, physical manifestation. It started subtly, almost playfully. Objects in the room began to move when I wasn't looking. I'd leave the heavy logbook on the central console, turn my back for a moment to check a gauge, and when I turned back, it would be lying on the floor 10 feet away. A metal cup of water I'd placed carefully in the center of a table slid, on its own, to the edge, and fell with a clang that was shockingly loud in the stillness. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was the building's constant, subtle tilting, the unreliable gravity. But I knew that was a lie. This was deliberate. This was a display of power. It was a cat playing with a stunned, terrified mouse. Later that night, I was jolted awake by a profound, penetrating cold. The generator had died. The steady, comforting hum that had been my only shield was gone. The operations room was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness, broken only by the faint, sickly red glow of a few emergency lights. And in that hellish crimson twilight, I saw the heavy steel door that led to the corridor slowly, silently, swinging open, by itself. The groan of its hinges, a sound that should have been mundane, was now the most terrifying sound in the world. I held my breath, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. There was no one in the dark doorway, but I could feel it. I could feel a presence flow into the room, a wave of cold air, a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure. Something large and cold and utterly invisible had just entered the room with us. I scrambled backwards, my hands sliding on the smooth concrete floor until my back pressed against the cold steel of an equipment rack. My hand fumbled in the darkness and closed around the heavy, solid steel of the wrench I'd left on a work table. I gripped it so hard my knuckles ached. I could hear it, not with my ears, but with my entire body. It was a silent displacement of air, a subtle warping of the space around it. It moved across the room, its path marked by the way the red emergency lights seemed to bend and distort around its unseen form. It was moving towards Casey. I watched in frozen horror as the sleeping bag in the corner, the one containing Casey's motionless form, lifted slightly, as if an invisible hand had taken hold of the fabric. Casey didn't make a sound. A surge of protective rage, the last flicker of my role as the senior man, broke through my terror. "Leave him alone!" I yelled, my voice a pathetic, wavering croak in the vast silence. The response was instantaneous and violent. A massive rack of electronic equipment on the far wall, a solid steel cabinet weighing at least 500 pounds, was hurled across the room as if it were a cardboard box. It crashed into the opposite wall with a deafening explosion of shattering vacuum tubes and screeching, tortured metal. Sparks erupted in the darkness. I flinched back, shielding my head as pieces of debris rained down. It was a show of force, a warning, or perhaps an invitation to a different kind of dance. And then it turned its full attention to me. I felt a touch on my cheek. It was a touch of impossible, bone-deep cold. There was no hand, no fingers, just a focused spot of absolute cold that felt like it was freezing my skin on a cellular level. And with the touch came a thought, injected directly into my mind. It wasn't a word or a voice. It was a pure, conceptual understanding. It showed me an image of the infinite, black, frozen void between galaxies, and it filled me with the feeling of what it was to be utterly, completely, and eternally alone. The sheer alienness of it, the cosmic despair, was a physical blow. I screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure terror, and I swung the wrench with all my might at the space where I felt the cold. The heavy tool whistled through the empty air and slammed into the concrete wall with a sickening crunch. The presence, the cold, the mental pressure, it all vanished in an instant. I was left alone in the wrecked, red-lit room, panting for breath, my body shaking with adrenaline. I stumbled over to Casey. He was still lying in the same position, but his eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on the ceiling. They were glassy and utterly vacant. I put my fingers to his neck, praying to feel a pulse. There was nothing. His skin was cold and clammy. His heart had simply stopped. It was fear that had killed him. A pure, concentrated, weaponized dose of fear, administered directly to his soul. I staggered back, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. The last man alive in a concrete tomb, haunted by a ghost in the machine that had just demonstrated it could kill without laying a finger on me. And I was next. My eyes scanned the chaos of the room. The overturned rack, the shattered glass, the dead body of my partner. My gaze fell upon one of the severed steel cables that lay coiled on the floor like a dead snake, and then I saw it. On the wall, next to the heavy anchor bolt from which the cable had been torn, something had been scratched into the concrete. I scrambled over, my flashlight beam shaking. It was a series of numbers, etched into the wall with what must have been a piece of sharp metal, a sequence of frequencies, and underneath the numbers, a single, scrawled word. Thompson. And below that, 2 more words. Last chance. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But it was a message from the past. A plan. A desperate final gambit from a man who had understood what was happening before it consumed him. I looked from the writing on the wall to the still form of Casey. My despair. My terror. It began to curdle and transform into something else. A cold, hard, crystalline rage. It had cornered me. It had taken my partner. It had toyed with my mind and shown me its power. And in the red, silent gloom of that wrecked operations room, I realized there was only one move left on the board. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I wasn't going to wait for it to come for me. I was going to it. I was going to the source. And I was either going to shut it down, or I was going to die trying to take it with me. The decision, once made, brought a strange, almost serene calm. The fear was still there, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of my stomach, but it was no longer in control. It had been superseded by purpose. I had a mission. I had to get to the sublevel. I had to get to the central hydrophone junction, the point where the station physically connected to the bedrock. According to Thompson's frantic notes, that was the heart of the beast. My preparations were swift and methodical. The survival instinct, the muscle memory of 1,000 drills, took over. I found the station's main first aid kit in a supply locker, cleaned and bandaged a gash on my forearm from a piece of flying shrapnel. I found the largest, most powerful maglite flashlight in the workshop. I took the heavy steel wrench, no longer as a weapon against an intangible foe, but as a tool. And most importantly, I carefully copied the sequence of numbers from the wall onto the palm of my left hand with a permanent marker. Thompson's frequencies. Thompson's last chance. The door to the sublevel was at the far end of the main corridor. It was another one of those heavy, naval-style steel doors with a large spoked wheel for a handle. A faded sign stenciled on it read, "Restricted Area, Level B, High Voltage." I put my shoulder into the wheel and turned. It moved with a deep, groaning reluctance, the locking pins retracting with a series of loud, metallic clunks. As the door swung open, a wave of air washed over me. It smelled of damp earth, chilled concrete, and that same sharp, electric smell of ozone, but stronger here, much stronger. A narrow flight of steel stairs descended steeply into absolute darkness. I began the climb down. Every footstep on the metal stairs rang out with a sharp clang, an alien sound that was immediately swallowed by the profound, waiting silence. The deeper I went, the more intense the physical sensations became. The vertigo was no longer subtle. It was a constant, powerful lurching, as if the entire staircase was tilting and swaying beneath me. The feeling that gravity had become a negotiable concept was overwhelming. The concrete walls of the tunnel at the bottom of the stairs were no longer stable. They seemed to shimmer, to vibrate with a low-frequency energy that made my vision blur at the edges. The very geometry of the space was becoming unstable. I moved down a long, narrow concrete tunnel. Running along the wall was the cable, the main, heavily armored hydrophone trunk line from Thompson's diagram. It was my guide, my lifeline, leading me into the heart of this impossible labyrinth. And the further I walked, the more aggressive the entity became. It was done with subtlety. It was actively trying to stop me now. Ahead of me, the corridor itself seemed to melt. The parallel lines of the walls warped and bent, twisting like taffy, the floor rising and falling in slow, nauseating waves. I dropped to my hands and knees, overcome by a wave of violent nausea. I had to crawl the last 50 feet, my hand gripping the cold, solid reality of the armored cable, the only stable thing in this fluid, nightmarish world. Then the auditory assault began again. But this time, it wasn't sounds from my past. It was a cacophony of utterly alien noises. A series of sharp, painful clicks, a grinding, mechanical screeching, and a piercingly high-frequency whistle that felt like it was trying to drill its way through my skull. It was like listening to a radio trying to tune into a broadcast from another dimension. Up ahead, I saw the final door, the entrance to the central hydrophone junction room, but my path was blocked. The last section of the corridor was filled with a shimmering, transparent field of energy. It was the same distortion I had seen on my first night, but now it was a solid, vibrating wall of force, stretching from floor to ceiling. The air around it crackled with static electricity, and the high-pitched whine was emanating from it. I knew instinctively that to touch it would be to be torn apart. I stopped, my lungs burning, my body trembling, and then my flashlight beam fell on a heavy-duty electrical junction box mounted on the wall just before the energy field. A thick conduit ran from the box to some unseen emitters that were projecting the barrier. On the cover of the box was a stenciled label: Emergency Containment Field, Auxiliary Power, Circuit 7. This was it. This was the final guardian. Thompson's final puzzle. I stumbled to the box and pried open the heavy steel cover. Inside was a complex web of thick, color-coded wires and a bank of heavy-duty, knife-switch-style circuit breakers. I looked down at my left palm, at the sequence of numbers I had copied from the wall. They weren't just frequencies. They had to be a code, a sequence for rerouting the power. Taking a deep breath, I began to move the heavy switches, following the sequence from my palm. 4, 7, 2, 1. With each loud thunk of a thrown switch, the pitch of the whine from the energy field changed, becoming higher, then lower, then sputtering. I could feel it. I was doing something. I was destabilizing it. When I slammed the last switch into place, the shimmering field in front of me flickered violently, like a dying television screen. And then, with a low implosive thump, it vanished. The path was clear. I stood before the final door. It was even more massive than the one to the sublevel, a solid plug of what looked like reinforced titanium, with a huge, bank vault-style wheel in the center. The stenciled warning on it was stark. Danger. Extreme energy field. Authorized personnel only. I placed my trembling hands on the cold, grooved metal of the wheel. I knew that behind this door lay the answer. The answer to Miller and Thompson's madness. The answer to Casey's death. The answer to the silence. I took one last ragged breath, filling my lungs with the ancient electric-smelling air. The air here felt old. It smelled of ozone and cold, distant stars. I threw my entire body weight into turning the wheel. There was a deafening shriek of protesting metal as massive, unseen locking pins began to retract within the door. Slowly, with an almost unbearable effort, the massive titanium plug began to slide sideways into the wall. A brilliant, pulsating blue-green light flooded the corridor, so intense it forced me to squeeze my eyes shut. And what I saw when I finally managed to open them. Dear God. No report. No recording, no fever dream nightmare could ever prepare a human being for the sight that lay beyond that door. The colossal titanium door slid fully open, and I was standing on the precipice of insanity. The chamber beyond wasn't a room. It was a void. A perfect sphere, perhaps 100 feet in diameter, its walls, floor, and ceiling all constructed from a seamless, polished black material that didn't reflect light, but seemed to drink it, to inhale it. It was the purest black I had ever seen. And floating in the exact center of this spherical void was nothing. And yet, it was also everything. It was a point of pure, crushing, absolute silence. A silence so dense, so total, that it was a visible distortion in space. A hole in the world. It was a perfect sphere of non-existence. A black hole not for light or matter, but for reality itself. It did not pull things in. It erased them from being. Suspended around this central point of nothingness, pulsing with a slow, hypnotic, respiratory rhythm, was the source of the intense blue-green light. It emanated from dozens of thick armored cables that emerged from the black walls at regular intervals. They snaked through the void, all terminating a few feet from the central sphere of silence, their ends crackling with contained, arcing energy, like a high-tech crown of thorns. They weren't powering it. They were containing it. This wasn't a source. It was a cage. An impossibly advanced, non-terrestrial containment unit built around a flaw in the universe. I took a hesitant step over the threshold. The moment I entered the sphere, gravity became a memory. My feet lifted from the floor, and I was floating, weightless, slowly, like a deep-sea diver in a silent alien ocean. I began to drift towards the center of the chamber, towards the heart of the silence. Raw, primal terror warred with a sense of profound, almost religious awe. I was in a place no human being was ever meant to see, witnessing something that defied every known law of physics. As I drifted closer to the central anomaly, I felt it. I felt its consciousness, not as a presence, not as a thought, but as a direct, unfiltered connection. A torrent of pure information, of raw data, flooded my mind, a deluge that threatened to shatter my psyche. I saw the birth of nebulae and the agonizing, slow death of dying suns. I witnessed entire civilizations of crystalline beings rise and fall on planets orbiting alien stars, all in the span of a heartbeat. I saw creatures of pure energy and beings of living shadow waging wars across dimensions of twisted, non-Euclidean geometry. And in that blinding, terrifying instant, I understood. This was not an extraterrestrial, not in any sense we could comprehend. It was not a ship, or a probe, or a being. It was something far older, far more fundamental. It was a glitch, a bug in the source code of reality, a tiny, localized pocket of the primordial chaos that existed before the Big Bang, a flaw that had somehow, impossibly, gained a rudimentary form of awareness. And this station, Listening Post Kingfisher, had not been built by the US Navy to track Soviet submarines. It had been built, or perhaps humanity had been given the plans to build it, to contain this cosmic error, to weave a technological cocoon of stable, predictable physics around this pocket of anti-reality, to keep it from spreading like a cancer through our universe. Project Kingfisher was not a listening post. It was a prison. And Miller and Thompson and Casey and I, we weren't operators. We were the unwitting, ignorant jailers. And the prison was failing. The entity didn't want to harm us. It didn't want anything. It simply was. And its very state of being, its fundamental frequency of non-existence, was antithetical to ours. Its silence was not a weapon. It was a solvent, dissolving our reality as water dissolves salt. And in that same instant, I received one final devastating piece of information. The most terrifying of all. The entity wasn't just passively existing, it was learning. It had been studying us, through our instruments, through the electrical signals of our nervous systems, through the raw emotions it had provoked in us. It had learned the concepts of fear, and guilt, and despair. And it had just figured out how to escape. Not by breaking through the walls of its prison. It was going to upload itself. It was preparing to imprint its fundamental state of null reality, its perfect, absolute silence, onto the carrier wave of the Schumann resonance. It wasn't just going to escape its cage. It was going to turn the entire planet into its cage. It was going to overwrite our world, erase every living thing, every sound, every memory, until the Earth was just another silent, stable sphere of non-being. And I was the last man, the last flicker of consciousness that could stop it. I knew with absolute clarity what I had to do. This was my last chance. Not Thompson's. Mine. I pushed off a floating cable, propelling myself towards a control terminal that was suspended in the void near the wall. The screen was glowing, displaying the same sequence of numbers from Thompson's last chance note. I now realized it wasn't a code to disable the field. It was a calibration sequence. A desperate attempt by Thompson to retune and strengthen the containment field. But I wasn't going to fix it. I was going to overload it. I began to key in the sequence, but in reverse order. The screen immediately flashed with a stark red warning. Critical alert. Reverse sequence initiated. Catastrophic containment field collapse imminent. Abort? A single blinking button on the screen read, "Confirm." I slammed my palm against it. The blue-green light in the chamber pulsed violently, intensifying to a blinding glare. The deep hum of the containment field rose in pitch to an unbearable, shrieking whine. I felt a powerful, invisible force begin to drag me towards the central anomaly, towards the erasing void. I spun around in my weightless state and kicked off the terminal with all my strength, launching myself back towards the open doorway. I had to get out. The shriek of the dying containment field was now a physical force, vibrating through my bones. The smooth black walls of the sphere began to crack, and pure, raw, white light, the light of creation itself, began to pour through the fissures. The prison was tearing itself apart. I shot through the doorway like a human cannonball, tumbling end over end, and slammed hard onto the concrete floor of the corridor. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I ran without looking back, through the vibrating, reality-bending tunnel, up the swaying steel staircase. Behind me, the roar of the end of a small universe was growing, a sound that was erasing all other sound. I burst out of the sublevel and into the main building just as the concrete walls around me began to buckle and split. The entire station was disintegrating. I threw my shoulder against the main exit door, bursting out into the gray, silent dawn. I ran a few yards across the frosted ground and then collapsed, digging my fingers into the cold, wet earth. And then, the world turned white. A brilliant, utterly silent flash of light that seemed to vaporize the very air. It was followed by a shockwave, a wave not of sound, but of pure, crushing physical pressure that lifted me from the ground and threw me through the air like a child's doll. The last thing I felt before darkness swallowed me was the rough, solid texture of the ground against my cheek. And the last thing I heard, emerging from the white noise of my fading consciousness, was a quiet, almost imperceptible, but the most beautiful and welcome sound in the entire universe. A low, steady, electrical hum, 7.83 hertz, the heartbeat of the earth. It was back. I drifted back to consciousness on a slow, gentle tide of sensation. The first was the smell, a sharp, sterile, antiseptic smell that reminded me of hospitals. The second was a sound, a quiet, steady, rhythmic beeping. I opened my eyes. I was lying on a bed with a stiff, starchy mattress covered by a crisp white sheet. The ceiling above me was made of white acoustic tiles. I turned my head. An IV stand stood beside my bed, a clear bag of saline slowly dripping into my arm. Next to it was a heart monitor, the source of the blessed, life-affirming beeping. I was alive. By some impossible miracle, I had survived. The door to the room opened, and two men walked in. They were dressed in identical, nondescript gray business suits and plain white shirts. They had the same short, military-style haircuts and the same blank, impassive, emotionless faces. The men in black, only in a more bureaucratic shade of gray. They didn't introduce themselves. One of them pulled up a chair and sat down next to my bed. The other stood by the door, his arms folded, a silent, intimidating sentinel. "Mr. Kowalski," the seated man began. His voice was as gray and featureless as his suit, completely devoid of inflection or emotion. "How are you feeling?" I tried to speak, but my throat was raw and only a dry croak came out. He silently handed me a plastic cup of water from the bedside table. I took a few painful sips. "Where am I?" I finally managed to ask. "You're in a secure medical facility," he replied, his eyes never leaving mine. "You were found by a Navy search and rescue team on the shore of Lake Superior. You were unconscious and suffering from exposure. It appears you were caught in a sudden, violent electrical storm." A storm. That was their story. That was the official narrative they were constructing. "Lieutenant Casey," I started, my voice still a rasp. "Lieutenant Casey was a tragic loss," he interrupted, his tone as flat as if he were reading a weather report. "He was swept away by a rogue wave during the storm. A terrible accident, just like what happened to the station. We believe a lightning strike hit the main generator, causing a catastrophic fire and subsequent explosion. The facility was a complete loss." He delivered this monologue while looking directly into my eyes, a calm, unblinking stare. He was lying, and he knew that I knew he was lying. This wasn't a debriefing. It was an indoctrination. He was handing me my script, my new, official reality. "You acted with considerable bravery, Mr. Kowalski," he continued, his voice unchanging. "But we understand that due to the trauma of the event and a significant concussion you sustained, your memories of what happened may be fragmented, unreliable. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I just stared at him and, after a long moment, gave a slow, deliberate nod. I understood completely. I was the hero who conveniently remembered nothing. It was neat. It was tidy. "Your service with the United States Navy is now concluded. Permanently," he said, rising from his chair. "You'll be granted a full medical disability pension. We will provide you with a new identity, a new set of documents, and a new place to live. We strongly, strongly advise you to forget about Listening Post Kingfisher and about anything you think you might have experienced there. It would be in your own best interest." It was a threat, delivered with the polite, passionless efficiency of a government form. It was chilling. They weren't going to put a bullet in my head. They were going to do something far more insidious. They were going to erase me and then give me a new, empty life to live. And so, here I am, 30 years later, in this damp basement with this old, dusty tape recorder. They gave me the name Frank Mitchell. They set me up in a small, quiet house in a faceless suburb in Ohio, and they told me to forget. But I haven't forgotten. I can't. Every single night when I close my eyes, I'm terrified that I'll find myself back in that absolute crushing silence. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, I think I can still feel it. That subtle, gentle lurch. The feeling of the world being an unstable, untrustworthy place. They told me it was a storm. They told me it was a generator explosion. They wrote it down in a file and buried it in an archive. But I know the truth. I was there. I heard the silence. And I know that somewhere out there, in the cold, dark spaces between the stars, or in the cracks in the foundation of our own reality, it still exists. And I know, with a certainty that keeps me awake at night, that it's still listening. I reach out a trembling hand and press the stop button on the recorder. The little red light, my one defiant eye in the darkness, winks out. The recording is done. They told me it was a storm, but I know the truth. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still feel myself drifting, and I'm so afraid that one day I just won't stop. So that's the story. A story about how the ambition to look beyond our world resulted in a lifelong silence filled with the echo of an alien quiet. A story that proves some doors are better left unopened, especially when they lead to the basement of an abandoned station on the shore of Lake Superior. Officially, Listening Post Kingfisher was destroyed in an accident in 1982. But you and I both know the truth now. They weren't just listening, they were standing guard. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe. And be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, listen to the silence. Sometimes it has more to say than any noise.